The first time Thomas Caine heard the boatswain's whistle, he thought he'd gone deaf. It wasn't the sound itself, that shrill, slicing note. It was the silence that followed. 200 men froze mid-motion on the deck of the HMS Valiant, like someone had pressed pause on a living machine. All heads turned toward the quarterdeck. Orders followed sharp and fast. The spell broke. Men rushed back to work, coiling ropes, patching sails, hauling buckets. The ship breathed again. Thomas didn't move. He was still trying to understand where he was, how he got here, and what devil dragged him from a London alley to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. 2 nights ago? Or was it 3? He'd been drinking cheap gin, slumped behind a fish stall near Wapping Dock. He remembered the voices, the boot in his ribs, then blackness. When he woke, there were no stars above, only the dark beams of a gun deck, and the stink of wet wood, sweat, and old blood. They called it the press. Press ganged. A word that sounded clean, polite even. It wasn't. It was theft. Soul theft. 1 minute you had a life. Poor, maybe, but yours. Next you were property. Royal Navy property. Move, land rat, someone barked behind him. A hard shove knocked him against the rail. Thomas caught himself before his head met the cannon barrel. The man who pushed him was missing 2 teeth and had arms like twisted rope. You think this is a pleasure cruise? Grab that line. He grabbed it, not because he knew what to do. He didn't. But because he'd seen what happened to the ones who refused. He'd seen the boy with the split lip and broken wrist the night before. A powder monkey, barely 15, spoke back to the boatswain. Got lashed so bad he pissed blood. Life aboard wasn't complicated. It was hard, unforgiving. You followed orders. You hauled what needed hauling. You learned fast, or you suffered. Thomas learned quickly. He learned the difference between the mainmast and the mizzenmast. He learned how to rig a hammock so you didn't fall out when the ship rolled. He learned which men stole rations and which ones might share a drop of watered rum if you helped them scrub the deck. He learned not to ask questions, and he learned that sleep was not rest. It was escape. The few hours you were allowed to shut your eyes, shoulder to shoulder with sweating bodies and snoring mouths, were the only hours you weren't afraid. The fear never really left. Sometimes it was the fear of falling from the rigging, 50 feet up, sails flapping like demons in a storm. Sometimes it was the fear of disease. Men coughed blood into their blankets and whispered about scurvy, or worse, the flux. The worst fear, though, came with the beat of drums, when the captain's voice boomed across the deck and men scurried to their battle stations. Battle. Thomas had seen it once, not in books or on stages, like the rich folk back in London. He'd lived it. The Valiant had engaged a French frigate off the coast of Gibraltar. The order came down in the early hours. The ship transformed. Cannon hatches opened. Gun crews took position. Marines loaded muskets. The galley tables disappeared. Even the wounded were rolled aside. The roar was hell, not thunder. This was worse. The cannon fire shook bones. Wood splintered around him, shards slicing through flesh like knives. One man's face was peeled open by an oak sliver, blood spraying across the deck. Another lost a leg. The surgeon's corner looked more like a slaughterhouse than a place of healing. And through it all, Thomas ran powder. He carried charges from the magazine to the gunners, slipping on blood, ducking flying wood, ears ringing so bad he couldn't hear his own breath. He didn't know if he was brave or just numb. Maybe both. When the smoke cleared, the Valiant had won. The French ship limped away, broken. Men cheered, but it wasn't joy. It was relief, like prisoners who dodged the noose for another day. There were fewer men to cheer than before. Later, while scrubbing the blood from the deck with seawater and ash, Thomas stared at the empty hammock next to his. It had belonged to a man named Green. Quiet. Had a wife in Portsmouth. 3 children. Now he was nothing, just red stains and memories. It was then Thomas understood. Nelson could have all the glory he wanted. Let the admirals and politicians toast each other in parlors back home. But it was men like Greene, and hundreds more like him, who held the empire together, men who didn't sign up, men who didn't have a choice, men who died nameless, and boys like Thomas, who now called the sea home, not by love, but by force. The days blurred after the battle. Salt, sweat, blood, and smoke seemed to settle in the skin like a permanent tattoo. Thomas no longer noticed the sting of the sea air in his eyes, or the way the ship groaned in its sleep. He was becoming a sailor, not by title, but by survival. You had to become something else, something harder, or the ocean would chew you up. 3 new boys joined the crew that week, pressed from Bristol, all wide-eyed and pale as ghosts. One still had blacksmith's soot on his shirt. Another cried the first 2 nights quietly, so the older men wouldn't hear. Thomas didn't say anything to them. What was there to say? That it gets better? It didn't. You just stopped fighting it. The only time the crew saw land was when they anchored off a port to resupply. Sometimes Spain, sometimes Africa, once even the Canary Islands. But they weren't allowed to go ashore, not unless they were part of the landing party or had earned shore leave. And that was rare. Men had jumped ship before. Most didn't make it far. The Navy hunted deserters like animals. There was a man named Cooper, tall, fast, smart. One night, he slipped over the side during a foggy anchor. They found him a week later, tied to a dock post in Lisbon. Locals said the redcoats dragged him out of a brothel. He came back with torn clothes and broken fingers. Didn't speak after that, just stared at his boots. 3 days later, he went up the ratlines during his watch and didn't come down. They said he slipped. Thomas wasn't so sure. Even with all that, the worst wasn't the sea or the beatings or the battles. It was the boredom. The long stretches between action turned men strange. They played dice games until fists flew. They sang filthy songs. They carved pictures into the wood of the gun deck. Naked women, ships, crosses. One man swore the carving of a siren he made whispered to him at night. Another thought the rats were trying to talk in French. Thomas just watched. He'd taken to sleeping less and listening more. That's how you stayed ahead. Not by fighting, but by learning the quiet rules no one spoke aloud. He learned which sailors were quick to anger, which officers you never crossed, which decks to avoid at night. And he learned how to read the mood of the ship, like you read the weather. When the mood soured, trouble followed. It was a morning like any other. The sun rising bloody over the horizon, the deck soaked in dew, hammocks stowed and scrub buckets out. But there was tension in the air. You could feel it in your teeth. Rum's short, someone whispered. Rations cut, it spread fast. The whispers, the glances, the slow shift in posture when officers passed by. The Navy didn't call it mutiny unless someone raised a hand or voice. But men could rebel quietly too. Slower work, louder footsteps, ignored orders. Death by 1,000 small disobediences. The boatswain, Mr. Griggs, noticed first. He was a bastard, but not a stupid one. He cracked his whip a little louder that day, made an example of 2 late risers. Thomas kept his head down and his hands moving, even though his belly growled like a chained dog. That night, below deck, the grumbling grew teeth. Why the hell we starving? One sailor hissed. We take ships, but can't even eat. They feast in the wardroom while we gnaw biscuits like rats. The biscuits were hard enough to break teeth. The salted beef looked more like boot leather. And the peas? Half maggots, if you were lucky. But it wasn't just the food. It was the disrespect. The weight of being forgotten. They think we're animals. Someone spat. Thomas stayed silent, but he listened. The next morning, a fight broke out during breakfast. A sailor threw his tin cup at the cook. Someone else knocked over a water barrel. It wasn't much, just noise, but it was enough to get the captain's attention. They cleared the deck at midday. The sun burned hot, and every man stood in silence as they dragged out the culprit. Not the cook, not the officer, but a skinny lad named Jenkins who'd shouted too loud and too often. He was only 19. They tied him to the mast. 10 lashes, the first lieutenant announced, voice cold. Thomas looked away. The whip cracked. Men flinched. The deck watched, hearts beating like war drums. The blood wasn't the worst part. It was the silence after. That was the Navy's real weapon. Not cannons, not discipline. Fear. Later that night, Thomas found himself staring at his own hands. They were hard now, calloused, strong. But he still remembered what they looked like before. Soft, ink-stained, with fingers used to holding books and coins, not ropes and cutlasses. The man he used to be was fading. He wasn't sure if that was good or terrifying. The days after the lashing passed in a strange kind of quiet. Not peace, never that, but a stillness, like the ship itself was holding its breath. No one spoke about Jenkins, not even the ones who'd shared grog with him. He lay in his hammock, shirtless, his back torn like parchment. The ship's surgeon gave him a rag soaked in rum and told him to bite it. That was all the care he got. By the 4th day, Jenkins was dead. Fever took him. Maybe infection. Maybe just too much pain. Either way, it didn't matter. The bosun's mates wrapped him in canvas, stitched it shut with sail thread, and slid a round shot between his feet. They held the burial at dawn. One less mouth to feed, someone muttered behind Thomas. No prayers, no words, just the splash. Thomas didn't flinch. He just stared at the water until the ripples faded. He was getting good at that, watching death and not blinking. A skill, he supposed, the kind you needed to survive here. A week later, they were back at sea, sails full, wind cruel and sharp. The Valiant was part of a larger fleet now. 6 ships headed for the Caribbean. Rumors spread fast. French colonies, sugar islands, gold. Some said they'd be storming Saint-Domingue. Others said Martinique. It didn't matter. Orders came from on high, from men in powdered wigs and velvet coats who never touched a rope in their lives. What mattered was, the ship grew tense again. The Caribbean sounded warm and sweet, but every sailor knew it was hell in disguise. Fever, mosquitoes, poisoned water. Men died faster there than they did in battle. The sun could kill you just as quick as a French musket. But orders were orders. They passed the Azores in a storm that nearly split the mizzenmast. Thomas spent 36 hours soaked to the bone, hauling lines and fighting winds that screamed like banshees. They lost 2 men to the sea. One was washed straight off the bow. No one even saw it happen. Just a cry, then nothing. The sea gave, but it also took. After the storm, they limped south for repairs. The rigging was torn, half the sails shredded. The carpenter worked day and night, and in those days of dragging calm, no wind, just the ship creaking like a dying house, tempers flared. One morning, a fight broke out below deck. A stolen biscuit. That's all it took. Fists flew, blood spattered the planks, and one man bit clean through another's ear. They hauled both up in chains. The captain ordered 6 lashes for each, for disgraceful conduct in His Majesty's service. Thomas didn't watch this time. He sat by the gun deck, cleaning his musket, pretending the world outside his barrel didn't exist. That night, he found himself talking to old Martin, a grizzled sailor with skin like worn leather and eyes that had seen too much. "You'll last," Martin said. After a long silence, Thomas looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you've stopped asking why." Thomas said nothing, but he knew the old man was right. The first few weeks aboard, all he did was ask questions in his head. Why me? Why now? Why this hell? But the ocean didn't care. Neither did the captain, nor the war. You either adapted or you broke. Like Jenkins, Martin leaned back, chewing on a bit of tobacco. You know, lad, the sea's like a god, demands blood, and every ship's a floating church. You give offerings, you pray to survive, but mostly you just wait. Wait for what? For the day you either go home, he paused, or you go under. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. The creaking of the hull sounded louder than usual. The sea whispered things he didn't want to hear. A few days later, they saw land, distant, green, and steaming. The Caribbean. The heat hit like a fist. Sweat pooled in every crease. Flies thickened in the galley. Below deck, the air turned to soup. Men stripped their shirts, but it didn't help. Fights grew more frequent. So did sickness. One sailor collapsed at his station, eyes wide, mouth foaming. Another started screaming in his hammock, clutching his gut. "Poisoned!" he cried, before vomiting black. The surgeon shrugged. "Yellow Jack," he muttered. Yellow fever. The invisible killer. Men started sleeping farther apart, sharing less, talking softer. A ship that once moved like a single machine was beginning to fracture. Fear in every crack. And just when Thomas thought things couldn't get worse, the orders came. Boarding party. French-held island. Reinforced. A raid. The guns were cleaned, blades sharpened, muskets loaded. Battle was coming again. Thomas checked his gear, said nothing, and listened for the whistle. It always began with the whistle. The morning of the raid, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that creeps under your skin and settles in your bones. No songs, no laughter, no footsteps overhead. Just the distant creak of ropes and the whisper of the ocean licking the hull. Thomas stood on the lower gun deck, staring at his musket. He had cleaned it 3 times already. It didn't matter. In the madness of battle, it might not even fire. Half the time, the powder turned to clumps in the heat and humidity. But it gave him something to do, something to hold that wasn't fear. They were heading for Saint-Pierre, a fortified French port nestled on the coast of Martinique. Intelligence said the French had a supply ship anchored in the bay, lightly guarded. But everyone knew intelligence came from men in clean uniforms, not from anyone who'd ever spilled blood in the surf. Still, orders were orders. The captain gathered the boarding party just after dawn. 50 men, cutlasses, pistols, black powder horns slung across chests. They were rowed in quietly. 6 longboats skimming the waves like ghosts. Thomas was in the second boat. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of oars and the hiss of wind cutting through palm fronds in the distance. It should have been beautiful, even peaceful, but all Thomas felt was a tight knot under his ribs. He thought of his mother for the first time in months. Her face was fading in his mind, blurred like a dream. He couldn't remember the sound of her voice. That frightened him more than the musket clutched in his hand. The boats hit the shallows, and men jumped out into waist-deep water. Musket barrels lifted above their heads, packs soaked, boots filling with sand. They moved up the beach quickly, crouched low among the ferns and jagged coral. Then, the whistle. Not theirs. French. A cry tore through the air, then the crack of gunfire. A musket ball slapped into the sand inches from Thomas's foot. Someone screamed. Another went down, water turning pink. It had been a trap. The French were waiting in the tree line. The beach erupted in smoke and chaos. Sailors fired blindly, some hitting trees, others falling back into the water. Frenchmen shouted in thick accents, voices raised over the roar of muskets and the pop of pistols. Thomas dropped behind a rock, heart slamming against his chest. He fumbled with his powder, hands slick with sweat and salt. A shot rang past his ear. Too close. He loaded, fired, ducked, loaded again. He couldn't see who he hit, or if he hit anyone at all. The world had turned into thunder and fire. He saw a man next to him take a ball to the throat, went down gurgling, hands clawing at the sky. "Push up!" someone shouted. "Push up the hill!" They moved like animals, clawing through jungle brush, shoving past roots and ferns, blood mixing with mud. Thomas found himself shoulder to shoulder with men he barely knew, eyes wild, shirts torn, covered in dirt and powder burns. At the top of the hill was the French outpost, just 4 walls of wood and a few cannons. But it looked like a fortress to them. Bayonets fixed. No more muskets, just steel. The charge was desperate. Men screamed like wolves, clashing with French Marines in the narrow paths. It was chaos, grunts, metal, screams, the thud of boots. Thomas stabbed without thinking, without aiming. Once, twice, 3 times, until his blade snapped inside a man's ribs. He didn't even stop to see the face. When the smoke cleared, it was over. Bodies littered the ground. French, British, some too torn to tell which. The outpost was taken, the supply ship in flames. But the cost? Only 20 men made it back to the boats. Thomas sat in the surf, blood drying on his face, staring at nothing. His hands shook. He felt sick, not because of what he'd seen, but because of what he'd done. There was a boy among the dead, no older than 16, a French drummer, chest torn open, still clutching his drumsticks. Thomas couldn't stop looking at him. Back on the Valiant, no one cheered. No medals, no speeches, just silence. The wounded moaned below deck. The dead were wrapped and counted. The ship turned north, leaving smoke rising from the coast like a ghost. Thomas didn't sleep that night, not even a blink. He sat alone by the quarterdeck, staring into the black waves and thought, "This is who I am now. Not a man, not a sailor, not even a survivor, just one more piece of the machine." The sea didn't mourn the dead. By the next morning, the Valiant was back under full sail, wind in her canvas, cutting north toward Antigua. The bodies from the raid were gone, stitched, weighted, and dropped overboard before dawn. No graves, no markers, just a splash and silence. Thomas stood watch that day, but his mind wasn't with the ship. His hands moved by habit, checking lines, adjusting sails, hauling rope. But his thoughts were still on that beach, on the boy with the drum, on the broken blade in his own hand, and the feeling of a man's weight collapsing against him. He hadn't eaten. Couldn't. Old Martin passed by and handed him a piece of ship's biscuit. It was hard as stone, but Thomas took it out of respect. He didn't eat it, just held it, feeling its rough edge against his palm. "They never warn you about the silence after," Martin muttered. "You win, you lose, doesn't matter. The sea don't clap. It just waits." Thomas looked at him. "Do you get used to it?" Martin's face cracked into something between a smile and a grimace. "You don't? You just forget how to feel anything else." Below deck, the surgeon worked over the wounded. The smell was unbearable. Blood, sweat, rum, and something rotten underneath. One man had lost both legs. Another had taken a bayonet through the belly. No morphine, no mercy, just a bite of leather and the saw. Thomas didn't visit the wounded. He couldn't. He'd seen enough. His soul felt heavy, like he'd swallowed iron. And yet, the world went on. The sun rose. The ship creaked. Orders were shouted. Life aboard returned to its usual rhythm. That was the cruelest part. No one above cared what you'd done yesterday, only what you'd do today. You could have slaughtered a dozen men on shore and be ordered to scrub the deck the next morning, like none of it happened. There was no room for reflection, no space to grieve. You worked, or you were punished. The weeks that followed were rough. Tropical storms battered the ship day and night. Rain came down in sheets, and the sea turned violent. Waves taller than houses smashed against the hull, knocking men clean off their feet. One man was swept overboard during a night watch. They tossed a rope, but it was too late. His scream was lost in the thunder. His name was Perkins. He'd survived the raid, survived Yellowjack, but not the sea. Thomas barely blinked when it happened. By then, he'd learned not to look too long at anyone's face. The more you knew a man, the more it hurt when he vanished. Better to keep your distance. Be polite, but not friendly. Helpful, but not close. It was safer that way. He spent his free time alone now, sitting near the stern, watching the wake of the ship trail off into the horizon. Sometimes he tried to remember home, but the memories came distorted. Faces were blurs, voices muffled. Even his own name sounded strange when he whispered it. He wasn't Thomas anymore. Not really. He was a powder runner, a gun deck ghost, a pressed soul in a navy that didn't care whether he lived or died, only that he obeyed. And yet, something inside him refused to break completely. It wasn't hope. That was long gone. It was something deeper, a sliver of rage. Not wild, screaming rage, but cold, silent fury. At the officers who drank wine in their quarters while the crew bled. At the dockyard lords who sent boys to die for sugar and coin. At the flag he served without ever choosing to. Sometimes he stared at the lieutenant on duty and wondered what would happen if he pushed him overboard. Sometimes he dreamed of fire. But mostly, he just kept moving. One rope, one cannon, one breath at a time. He wasn't trying to live anymore. He was just trying not to disappear. The Valiant reached Antigua after 23 days at sea. By the time they dropped anchor, the crew looked half dead, thin, sunburnt, and hollow-eyed. Some tried to smile when they saw land. But it was the kind of smile a starving dog gives when someone holds food just out of reach. Because land didn't mean freedom. It meant repairs, resupply, drill, work. The island was bright and green and beautiful. Palm trees waving lazily along the hills, white sand glimmering under the sun. But none of it belonged to the men aboard. They were allowed to look at it, smell it, taste the breeze that came off it, but not touch it. Permission to go ashore was given to officers only. The crew stayed behind the rails like prisoners watching a world they couldn't enter. For Thomas, it was torture. The smell of roasting meat drifted across the harbor from some tavern or cook fire in town. Real meat. Fresh. Spiced. He swallowed hard until his throat ached. Meanwhile, the galley handed out salted beef so tough it might as well have been rope. That night, the muttering started again. 2 months at sea. And for what? We ain't dogs. They treat us worse than slaves. Thomas didn't join in, but he heard every word. It struck him that something had changed. The men weren't just tired or angry. They were near breaking, the kind of edge where one spark could turn into a fire. And soon enough, the spark came. A young sailor named Finch, newly pressed, maybe 18, was caught sneaking rum from the officers' stores. He wasn't drinking it. He was just holding the bottle, staring at it like it was a memory of another life. They dragged him out by the collar, kicking and begging. The captain ordered 20 lashes. 20. Everyone knew that meant death. The crew was summoned to witness, as always. A circle of bodies, silent faces, no wind, just the creak of the boards and the crackle of the whip being oiled. Finch's shirt was torn from his back. His ribs were sharp under his skin. He cried like a child, begging, choking out words through tears. "Please, sir, I just wanted a sip. I'm sorry. Please." The captain didn't blink. The first lash drew blood. By the 5th, his voice was gone. By the 9th, flesh hung from his spine. By the 12th, he was unconscious. They gave him all 20 anyway. When it was over, he wasn't breathing. The captain turned and walked away, as if he'd just finished signing a letter. Thomas watched the officers leave, boots polished, cuffs clean, while the dead boy lay in the dirt like garbage. Something inside him shifted. Not fear, not grief, a realization. The enemy wasn't just out there, in French forts or enemy ships. The enemy could wear your own flag. That night, below deck, the silence was suffocating. No dice games, no songs, just breathing, raw, heavy, angry. The kind of stillness that says more than shouting ever could. Old Martin spoke first, voice low. This ship's dying from the inside. No one disagreed. Another sailor muttered, "They'd kill us all if it made the mainsail flap straighter." Thomas didn't speak, but his hands curled into fists. For months, he had bent, endured, survived. Tonight, something inside him stopped bending. He lay awake in his hammock, staring at the beams above his head, feeling his heartbeat thudding like a drum. He thought of Finch, of Jenkins, of Cooper, of the nameless boy on the French beach. Men didn't die at sea because of war alone. They died because no one cared if they lived. And for the first time, a thought came to Thomas not as a whisper, but as a certainty. Someone will have to make them care. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he knew this. He was done being silent. The next morning, the wind was gone. The Valiant sat still in the harbor like a beast with broken wings. The water around her shimmered like hot glass. The sun overhead a white eye that never blinked. Below deck, the heat pressed down like a hand on the chest. Sweat dripped from beams, soaked hammocks, and turned every breath into labor. Work continued, of course. It always did. The officers strutted on the quarterdeck in their polished boots while the crew swabbed, polished, hauled, and starved. A fresh shipment of vegetables had been brought on board for the wardroom. Onions, lemons, fresh bread, wine. The crew got salted pork and half rations of biscuit, the same as ever. A man named Hargreaves, big-shouldered and slow to speak, finally snapped. He saw one of the midshipmen toss half an apple over the side, laughing as it splashed. Hargreaves just stood there, mop in hand, staring. Then he walked over to the rail, reached down into his pocket, and threw his entire biscuit overboard. The midshipman turned. "What do you think you're doing?" Hargreaves didn't answer. He just looked him in the eye and said, "If it's waste, we're doing now. Sir, I'll waste mine too." By noon, Hargreaves was in chains, and that's when it started. Not open mutiny, not yet, but the beginning of it. Orders were delayed, ropes mysteriously tangled, buckets spilled, knots tied wrong, gunpowder went missing. Men worked slower, moved quieter, and looked each officer in the eye with a strange calm. They didn't shout or threaten. That would have been easy to punish, but they had learned something better. Resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. It looks like doing just enough to stay alive, and no more. It looks like letting the ship rot from within. Thomas didn't lead any of it, not at first, but the others watched him. They remembered who he was during the raid, how he'd moved, how he'd fought, how he'd come back not proud, but changed. They looked to him like he might say something, do something. He didn't. Not right away, but something was building inside him. A slow, steady fury that had no place to go. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and turned the water red, Thomas found himself alone near the gun deck. The cannons gleamed in the fading light, freshly oiled, tools neatly stacked. The officers would be dining now. Roast meat, wine, their polished laughter drifting through the slats above. He looked at the powder stores. It would take just one spark. just one, and the Valiant would burn from the inside out. He didn't do it. Not that night. But the thought stayed with him, not as fantasy, but as a real option, a future. Later that week, 2 more men were flogged, one for inattention, the other for speaking out of turn. The next morning, the water barrel was fouled. No one knew who did it, or maybe everyone did, and no one said a word. That was the power the officers never understood. They thought obedience came from fear, but they had passed the point of fear. Now the men were angry, and anger was quiet, patient, focused. That night, Thomas met with Martin and 6 others in the dark corner of the lower deck. They didn't speak at first, just sat there, sharing the same space, breathing the same heavy air. Then Martin said, "How many of us do you think they'll let die before they notice?" Thomas looked around. "All of us." Someone else asked, "So what do we do?" Thomas didn't hesitate this time. "We wait." For what? He met their eyes. For the next mistake. They all knew it was coming. It always did. The officers weren't gods. They were men, cruel, careless men, and they always overreached. The next time they did, it wouldn't just be whispers. It would be fire. The mistake came at dawn. Not a storm, not a battle, just arrogance. The captain had a message to send. That discipline would return to the ship no matter what the men thought. He chose a boy to make the point. A young sailor named Reeve, no more than 15, was caught sleeping through his night watch. He wasn't lazy. He was sick. Yellow eyes, trembling hands. Everyone had seen it. He could barely hold a rope the day before, but the captain didn't care. 10 lashes, he barked, without trial, without pause. The crew gathered in silence, as always. No one moved, but this time something was different. You could feel it in the air, the kind of stillness that comes before lightning strikes. Reeve was dragged out and tied to the post. The boatswain lifted the whip, but it didn't fall, because Thomas stepped forward. One step, that was all. But on a warship, one step out of line meant everything. The boatswain froze, whip held in midair. The first lieutenant turned. "Return to your station, Caine." Thomas didn't move. His voice was calm. "He's a child." "Now." The officer's voice sharpened. Thomas's fingers curled into fists. "If you do this, you won't walk the deck again." The words echoed across the deck like cannon fire. Every man heard them, every officer too. No one breathed, and then someone else stepped forward. Then another, then Martin, then Hargreaves, still bruised from his time in chains, then half the gun crew. One by one, men stood. They said nothing, just stood. The whip dropped to the deck. The lieutenant looked to the captain, who stood stiff as a statue at the quarterdeck. For a moment, the whole ship hung in the balance. History, teetering on the edge of a knife. The captain took one step back, then 2. He turned without a word and walked below deck. The lash was never given. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was victory. It wasn't open mutiny. Not yet. No guns were fired, no flags changed, but something had shifted forever. The Valiant was no longer just a warship. It had become something else. A reckoning. From that day forward, things changed. Slowly. Quietly. The officers watched their tone. Punishment stopped. Rations were fairer. Work was still hard, but the cruelty eased. The sailors were still prisoners of duty, but not of silence. And Thomas became the man they looked to. He never asked for it, never wanted it. But when the day came, he had stepped forward. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but because someone had to. He still scrubbed decks, hauled rope, loaded cannons, but something in him had hardened into steel. Not the kind made in forges, but the kind made through pain, rage, and fire. Months later, when the Valiant returned to Portsmouth, no one cheered. The officers reported victory. The flag flew high. The papers would mention a raid, a skirmish, a minor triumph. They wouldn't mention the dead. They wouldn't mention the boy buried at sea with his back split open. They wouldn't mention the men who stood up and said enough. But that's how it always was. History remembered admirals. It forgot the hands that bled. It forgot the souls pressed into service, broken and rebuilt in salt and silence. But on the Valiant, those names lived on, not in books, in memory, and in the eyes of a young man named Thomas Caine, sailor, survivor, and spark